The morning of November 19th, 1943, aboard the battleship Musashi anchored at Truk Lagoon, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his cabin reading an intelligence summary that confirmed his darkest prophecy. The report, marked urgent and delivered by courier from Tokyo, detailed American naval construction rates over the previous 18 months. His staff officer watched as the admiral's face remained impassive, though his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the document's edge. The numbers told a story Yamamoto had predicted years before anyone would listen, a story of industrial capacity so overwhelming that tactical brilliance became merely a footnote to mathematical inevitability. In the time Japan had managed to launch one fleet carrier, the Americans had commissioned 8, and this was only the beginning. Yamamoto set down the report and turned to gaze through the porthole at Truk's vast anchorage, where the combined fleet lay at rest between operations. These ships represented the finest naval engineering Japan could produce, crewed by men whose skill and courage were beyond question. Yet the admiral knew with absolute certainty that none of it mattered. He had seen this future years ago, walking through American factories, driving through endless industrial suburbs outside Detroit, watching cargo ships crowd American harbors in a display of casual abundance that Japan could never match. The war was not yet 2 years old, and already the calculus he had presented to his superiors in 1941 was proving grimly accurate. Japan had won its 6 months. Now came the reckoning. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question of what Yamamoto truly thought as American shipyards performed, what seemed like industrial sorcery, is not one of speculation. Unlike many wartime leaders who left behind only public pronouncements and carefully crafted memoirs, Yamamoto's private correspondence and documented conversations with trusted staff officers reveal a man who understood from the very beginning that Japan's war with America was a race against time that Japan had already lost before the first shot was fired. His tragedy was not ignorance, but knowledge, the burden of seeing clearly what his nation refused to believe until the evidence became impossible to ignore. This is the story of how the architect of Pearl Harbor watched his most pessimistic predictions materialize with devastating precision, and how American industrial might transformed his greatest tactical triumph into strategic irrelevance in the span of less than 2 years. To understand Yamamoto's unique perspective, one must first recognize how different he was from the typical Imperial Japanese Navy officer of his generation. Born in 1884 in Niigata Prefecture, he had risen through the ranks during an era when Japan was rapidly modernizing its military along Western lines. But unlike most of his peers, whose understanding of Western nations came primarily from textbooks and brief diplomatic visits, Yamamoto had lived in America for extended periods. From 1919 to 1921, he studied English at Harvard University, an experience that gave him unprecedented insight into American culture, psychology, and industrial capacity. Later, from 1925 to 1927, he served as naval attaché in Washington, a posting that allowed him to observe American industry and society with the analytical eye of a career military officer. What Yamamoto saw during those years in America shaped every strategic calculation he would make for the rest of his life. He drove through the industrial heartland, visited factories, walked through shipyards, and most importantly, observed the American relationship with production and technology. Where Japanese industry relied on meticulous craftsmanship and careful resource allocation, American industry operated on principles of mass production, standardization, and seemingly limitless resources. He watched automobile factories in Detroit produce vehicles at rates that seemed almost fantastical. He saw steel mills operating at scales Japan could not hope to match. He observed a culture that treated engineering challenges not as insurmountable obstacles, but as problems awaiting inevitable solutions through innovation and brute force application of resources. Perhaps most significantly, Yamamoto recognized something about American character that many Japanese leaders either missed or dismissed as weakness. Americans, he noted, possessed an optimistic pragmatism that made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents in prolonged conflict. Where Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual strength, acceptance of sacrifice, and the nobility of fighting against overwhelming odds, American culture emphasized problem-solving, efficiency, and the assumption that any obstacle could be overcome with sufficient resources and ingenuity. This was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength, one that would prove devastating in industrial warfare. When Yamamoto returned to Japan, he carried these observations with him like a weight. Throughout the 1930s, as tensions between Japan and the United States escalated over Japanese expansion in China and Southeast Asia, Yamamoto found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. As a senior naval officer, he was expected to support national policy and prepare for potential conflict with Western powers. But as someone who actually understood American industrial capacity, he recognized that war with the United States would be catastrophic for Japan unless it could be won quickly and decisively, forcing a negotiated settlement before American industry fully mobilized. His warnings were consistent and explicit. In discussions with fellow officers and political leaders, Yamamoto repeatedly emphasized that Japan could not win a prolonged war with America. The resource disparity was too great, the industrial capacity too unbalanced. If war came, Japan would need to strike hard enough and fast enough to make the Americans lose their will to fight, accepting a negotiated peace that would leave Japan's gains in Asia intact. It was a desperate gamble, and Yamamoto knew it. But he also knew that if Japan's political leadership insisted on policies that would inevitably lead to war with the Western powers, then this gamble was the only option that offered even a slim chance of success. The famous quote often attributed to Yamamoto, that he could run wild for 6 months to a year but could promise nothing after that, captured his strategic assessment perfectly. Japan's existing fleet, if used aggressively and skillfully in the war's opening phase, could achieve temporary naval supremacy in the Pacific. Japanese pilots, rigorously trained and flying excellent aircraft, could dominate the skies. Japanese forces could seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter. But this window of opportunity would be brutally short. Once American industry transitioned to wartime production, once American shipyards began producing vessels at scale, once American training programs created new cadres of pilots and sailors, the mathematical inevitability would assert itself. Japan would be overwhelmed not by superior tactics or braver men, but by simple numbers. Ships, planes, weapons, and supplies produced at rates Japan could never match. By 1941, war had become virtually inevitable. Japanese expansion into French Indochina prompted American oil embargoes that threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military. The Imperial Japanese Navy consumed vast quantities of fuel oil, and without access to American petroleum, Japan would either have to abandon its imperial ambitions or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, an action that would certainly trigger war with Britain, the Netherlands, and by extension the United States. Japanese leadership chose war, and Yamamoto, as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was tasked with making the impossible possible. Defeating the United States Navy quickly enough to achieve negotiated peace before American industrial capacity made Japanese defeat inevitable. The result was the plan for Pearl Harbor, an operation so audacious that even many Japanese naval officers initially considered it too risky.
The idea was to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor, destroying enough battleships and carriers to cripple American naval power for the crucial first year of war. While the Americans reeled from this blow, Japan would seize Southeast Asian territories, establish fortified defensive positions, and make the cost of reconquering these territories so high that America would accept a negotiated settlement. It was a plan born of desperation and clear-eyed understanding of Japan's strategic weakness. Yamamoto did not design Pearl Harbor because he thought Japan was stronger than America. He designed it because he knew Japan was weaker, and this was the only way to exploit the brief window before that weakness became decisive. The attack on December the 7th, 1941, achieved tactical success beyond reasonable expectations. In a single morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,000 servicemen. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japanese forces advanced with stunning speed and efficiency. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered after a campaign that humiliated Western colonial powers. The Philippines came under Japanese control. The Dutch East Indies and their precious oil fields were seized. Burma fell, cutting off supply routes to China. In 6 months, Japan had conquered an empire and established what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vast territory that seemed to confirm Japanese military supremacy. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. He understood that Pearl Harbor, for all its tactical brilliance, had failed in its strategic objective. The American carriers, the most valuable targets, had been at sea during the attack and survived. More critically, the attack had not broken American will. Instead of suing for peace, America had responded exactly as Yamamoto feared it would, with grim determination to mobilize every resource until Japan was utterly defeated. President Franklin Roosevelt had gone before Congress asking for a declaration of war, not with words of caution or calculated diplomacy, but with phrases like, "a date which will live in infamy," that captured the American mood perfectly. This was not a nation preparing for negotiated compromise. This was a nation preparing for total war, and total war meant industrial war, the one kind of war Japan absolutely could not win. The first 6 months unfolded largely as Yamamoto had planned, though with worrying signs that careful observers could detect. Japanese forces advanced, but American resistance was often fiercer than expected. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo, did minimal physical damage, but tremendous psychological damage to Japanese confidence. If American carriers could approach close enough to launch bombers against the home islands, then the defensive perimeter was not as secure as Japanese planners assumed. More ominously, the raid demonstrated American aggressiveness and willingness to attempt audacious operations even when the strategic situation looked bleak. Then came Midway in June 1942, and with it, the end of Japan's brief period of seeming invincibility. In attempting to lure American carriers into a decisive battle where they could be destroyed, Yamamoto instead watched as American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, at their most vulnerable moment. In a single day, Japan lost 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. More critically, Japan lost hundreds of irreplaceable, experienced aircrew and maintenance personnel. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, but they still had operational carriers in the Pacific, and Yamamoto knew with cold certainty that more were coming. Because by mid-1942, the intelligence reports reaching combined fleet headquarters were beginning to tell a story that confirmed every warning Yamamoto had issued before the war. American shipyards were not just building ships. They were mass-producing them using techniques that Japan could barely comprehend. The United States had invoked the Two-Ocean Navy Act even before Pearl Harbor, but now that program was accelerating with wartime urgency and unlimited funding. Keels were being laid for fleet carriers of the new Essex class designed to incorporate lessons from early war experience and built using standardized components that allowed unprecedented construction speed. The Essex class program would ultimately produce 24 fleet carriers, each displacing approximately 27,000 tons and capable of carrying 90 to 100 aircraft. But the sheer number was only part of the story. What stunned Japanese naval intelligence was the speed of construction. The lead ship, USS Essex, had her keel laid in April 1941 and was launched in July 1942, just 15 months from start to launch, with commissioning following in December. This was a pace of carrier construction that Japanese shipyards, even operating at maximum capacity with unlimited resources, could not have matched, and Essex was just the first. Intelligence reports tracked ship after ship sliding down American ways. USS Yorktown, the second ship of the class named for the carrier lost at Midway, launched in January 1943. USS Intrepid followed in April. USS Hornet, second to bear that name, launched in August. Franklin in October. By late 1943, when Yamamoto received the intelligence summary that November morning at Truk, the Americans had launched or were about to launch Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, and more. Each name was another nail in the coffin of Japanese strategic hopes. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. In roughly the same period that Japan managed to launch one new fleet carrier, the Taiho, whose construction had been delayed by design changes and resource shortages, the Americans had commissioned 8 Essex-class carriers with more following at regular intervals. And these were just the fleet carriers. American yards were also producing dozens of light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, and even more escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls for convoy protection and amphibious support. By the end of 1943, the United States had more carriers in service or under construction than Japan had possessed at the height of its power in December 1941. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For Yamamoto, these intelligence reports represented the materialization of prophecy. He had warned that American industrial capacity would prove decisive. He had predicted that Japan's 6-month window would close, and the weight of American production would become irresistible. Now it was happening exactly as he had foreseen, with even greater speed than he had pessimistically calculated. The question was not whether Japan would be overwhelmed, but how quickly and completely the disaster would unfold. What made the situation even more desperate was that raw numbers told only part of the story. American carriers were not just numerous, they were improving with each new hull. The Essex class incorporated better damage control systems, improved anti-aircraft armament, more sophisticated radar and communication equipment, and enhanced aviation facilities. American naval doctrine was evolving rapidly based on combat experience, while Japanese doctrine remained largely static, constrained by tradition and the increasing difficulty of training new aircrew to replace combat losses. American pilots were being trained in vast numbers at facilities across the continental United States, safely beyond the reach of Japanese attack. Japanese training programs, hampered by fuel shortages and the need to defend far-flung territories, were producing fewer and less experienced pilots. The resource calculations were equally grim. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 20,000 tons of steel, a substantial investment, but one America could easily afford. U.S. steel production in 1943 exceeded 88 million tons. Japan's steel production that same year was approximately 8 million tons, and much of that was needed for merchant shipping, smaller warships, aircraft production, and munitions. Even building a single fleet carrier represented a significant allocation of resources that Japan could ill afford. The Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier when she finally commissioned in March 1944, consumed resources that might have built several destroyers or escort vessels desperately needed for convoy protection against the growing American submarine threat. American shipyards operated with advantages that went far beyond simple resource availability. The United States had developed prefabrication techniques that allowed sections of ships to be constructed inland, then transported to coastal yards for final assembly. This
distributed construction model meant that labor and industrial capacity from across the entire country could contribute to shipbuilding. Welding had largely replaced riveting in American construction, speeding assembly and reducing weight. Standardized components meant that parts could be manufactured at multiple facilities and assembled at any yard. The Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast were applying automobile industry mass production techniques to shipbuilding, with results that seemed impossible to observers accustomed to traditional methods. Japan had none of these advantages. Japanese shipyards relied on traditional construction methods, skilled craftsmen, and sequential assembly processes that could not be easily accelerated. Prefabrication was limited. Welding technology lagged behind American capabilities. Most critically, Japan's industrial base was geographically concentrated and increasingly vulnerable to American submarine interdiction of raw materials. The iron ore, coal, and oil that Japanese industry required had to be shipped from conquered territories through sea lanes that American submarines hunted with growing effectiveness. Every tanker sunk, every ore carrier sent to the bottom, meant Japanese industry producing less while American industry produced more. Yamamoto understood all of this with painful clarity. His staff officers would later recall conversations where the admiral discussed American production rates with a kind of fatalistic admiration. He did not dismiss American achievements as the product of crude mass production lacking Japanese refinement. Instead, he recognized that American industry had solved the essential problem of modern warfare, producing vast quantities of high-quality equipment quickly enough to replace losses and accumulate overwhelming numerical superiority. Quality mattered, certainly, but in industrial warfare, quantity had a quality all its own. One excellent carrier could not be in multiple places simultaneously. 8 carriers, even if individually somewhat less refined, could dominate an ocean. The human dimension of this industrial disparity was perhaps even more significant than the material dimension. American shipyards employed hundreds of thousands of workers operating in multiple shifts around the clock. These workers were well fed, adequately housed, reasonably paid, and motivated by both patriotism and the economic opportunities that wartime industry provided. American women entered shipyards in unprecedented numbers, demonstrating that talent and capability were not limited by gender when national survival was at stake. The famous Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda fantasy but statistical reality. Millions of American women working in industries that had previously excluded them and performing their jobs with skill that matched or exceeded their male counterparts. Japan had no equivalent reservoir of underutilized labor. Japanese women were not mobilized for industrial work in comparable numbers, partly due to cultural traditions that emphasized women's domestic roles, and partly because Japan's industrial infrastructure was not designed to accommodate rapid workforce expansion. Japanese industry had always relied on a core of skilled male workers, and while some women were employed in war production, they were primarily in lighter industries like electronics assembly or aircraft component manufacturing. Heavy shipyard work remained almost entirely male, and as military conscription pulled more men into combat roles, Japanese shipyards faced increasing labor shortages that no amount of exhortation to work harder could overcome. the strategic implications of carrier production rates extended far beyond simple naval arithmetic. Carriers were not just ships, they were mobile air bases that projected power across thousands of miles of ocean. Control of the sea in the Pacific War meant control of the air above it, and control of the air meant the ability to strike enemy positions, defend one's own forces, and support amphibious operations. The side with more carriers could bring more aircraft to any engagement, concentrate force at decisive points, and absorb losses that would cripple a numerically inferior opponent. By late 1943, American carrier supremacy was becoming so overwhelming that Japanese naval strategy was forced into increasingly desperate expedients. Yamamoto's conversations with his staff during this period, reconstructed from later testimony and contemporary notes, reveal a man wrestling with the implications of inevitable defeat. He did not indulge in false optimism or comforting delusions. When junior officers spoke enthusiastically about Japanese fighting spirit overcoming material disadvantages, Yamamoto would quietly point out that Spirit did not build carriers, Spirit did not produce aviation fuel, and Spirit did not replace lost aircraft. He respected the courage and dedication of Japanese servicemen, but he refused to pretend that courage alone could overcome the industrial tsunami approaching from the east. One particular conversation, recorded by his chief of staff Matome Ugaki in his diary, captures Yamamoto's state of mind in late 1943. Discussing intelligence estimates of American carrier construction, Yamamoto reportedly said that the Americans were accomplishing in months what Japan struggled to accomplish in years, and that this disparity would only grow wider as American industry reached peak efficiency. When asked if anything could be done to close the gap, Yamamoto's response was characteristically blunt. Japan could not close the gap because Japan did not have American resources, American industrial capacity, or American technological culture. The war would be decided not by tactics or courage, but by production rates and resource allocation, factors over which the combined fleet had no control. This was the reality that Yamamoto confronted daily as he planned operations and allocated forces throughout 1943. Every carrier lost to combat or accident was essentially irreplaceable in any time frame that mattered strategically. Every experienced pilot killed represented months or years of training that Japan could not afford to duplicate. Every ton of fuel oil consumed was one less ton available for future operations. Meanwhile, American carriers multiplied, American pilot training programs produced thousands of new aircrew, and American logistics delivered fuel, ammunition, and supplies in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. The Battle of Midway had been catastrophic for Japanese carrier aviation, but its full impact only became apparent in subsequent months. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, but believed it could eventually replace them. What proved irreplaceable was the organic capability that those carriers represented, the experienced aircrew, the skilled maintenance personnel, the accumulated knowledge of how to conduct carrier operations effectively. The new carriers Japan constructed, like Taiho, were technically impressive ships, but they sailed with aircrew who had a fraction of the experience possessed by the men who had struck Pearl Harbor. Training new pilots to that standard required time Japan did not have, and fuel Japan could not spare. American carrier air groups, by contrast, were growing more experienced and more numerous simultaneously. American pilots cycled through combat tours, then returned to training commands to pass their knowledge to new pilots. American carriers operated with larger air groups than Japanese carriers of comparable size, reflecting both greater fuel availability and different design priorities. American doctrine emphasized overwhelming strike power and robust defensive capabilities, assumptions that could only be maintained when resources were effectively unlimited. Japanese doctrine had evolved in an environment of resource scarcity,
emphasizing efficiency and concentration of force at decisive points. Both doctrines were logical within their respective contexts, but only one context provided the industrial foundation for sustained operations. By early 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted fundamentally. Japan still held vast conquered territories, but the initiative had passed to the Americans. At Guadalcanal, American forces had fought a grinding 6-month campaign that demonstrated their willingness to absorb casualties and pour in resources until Japanese resistance collapsed. The campaign consumed Japanese aircraft and pilots at rates that could not be sustained, while Americans replaced losses and reinforced success with apparent ease. When Japanese forces finally evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, the message was clear. America would fight for every island, and America had the resources to win those fights. Yamamoto planned operations throughout 1943,
with the knowledge that each engagement accelerated Japan toward inevitable defeat. The Aigo air offensive in April, launching massed airstrikes against Allied positions in the Solomons and New Guinea, achieved tactical successes, but at the cost of aircraft and pilots Japan could not replace. American forces absorbed the attacks, repaired the damage, and continued advancing. Yamamoto knew these operations were strategically futile, but operational necessity demanded that Japanese forces contest American advances rather than simply concede territory without resistance. It was a calculus of choosing between bad options and worse ones. The intelligence reports that crossed Yamamoto's desk through spring 1943 painted an increasingly stark picture. American submarines were strangling Japanese merchant shipping at accelerating rates. The vital tanker fleet that brought oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japanese refineries was shrinking faster than Japanese yards could build replacements. Escort vessels, desperately needed to protect convoys, were being allocated to fleet operations instead because every major engagement risked carrier losses that would leave fleet carriers without adequate screening forces. The Americans, meanwhile, were building destroyer escorts by the dozen specifically for convoy protection, a luxury Japan could not afford. Most ominously, intelligence indicated that American carrier construction was not slowing but accelerating. The Essex-class program was proceeding ahead of schedule. Additional light carriers were being commissioned at regular intervals. Even escort carriers, which the Japanese had initially dismissed as militarily insignificant, were proving valuable for convoy protection and amphibious support operations. By mid-1943, the United States had more escort carriers than Japan had carriers of all types, and this disparity would only widen. Yamamoto's death on April 18, 1943, came at a moment when the full scope of the disaster he had predicted was beginning to materialize but had not yet reached its catastrophic conclusion. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes, learned that Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour. The decision was made at the highest levels to intercept and kill him, both to deprive Japan of its most capable naval strategist and to demonstrate American cryptographic and operational capabilities. A flight of P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed Yamamoto's transport aircraft, shooting it down over the jungles of Bougainville. The admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had understood from the beginning that war with America was unwinnable, died before seeing the full vindication of his pessimistic predictions. The irony of Yamamoto's death was profound. The man who had given Japan its greatest naval victory, who had bought 6 months of triumph through audacious planning and flawless execution, did not live to see those 6 months extended into 2 years of grinding defeat. He was spared the final humiliation of watching American carriers dominate waters Japan had briefly controlled, of seeing Japanese carrier divisions reduced to ineffective remnants, of witnessing the industrial miracle he had always known America could perform, but Japan could not match. His successors inherited an impossible situation. By late 1943, The American carrier fleet was approaching a size where it could conduct multiple major operations simultaneously while maintaining powerful reserves. The Essex-class carriers that had seemed like distant threats when their keels were laid in 1941 were now operational warships with experienced crews and full air groups. USS Essex herself had joined the Pacific Fleet and participated in raids against Marcus Island and Wake Island, demonstrating the power of American naval aviation's new standard. USS Yorktown de Sioux, Lexington de Sekou, and Bunker Hill were conducting operations that would have required Japan's entire carrier fleet just 2 years earlier, and more carriers were coming, a steady stream of new hulls that seemed never-ending. The Japanese response to this carrier proliferation revealed strategic bankruptcy. Unable to replace lost carriers quickly or train replacement aircrew to competitive standards, Japanese naval planning increasingly relied on defensive operations, complex tactical schemes to negate American numerical superiority, and desperate hopes that one decisive battle might still shift the strategic balance. The doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement that would destroy the enemy in a single catastrophic battle, remained embedded in Japanese naval thinking, even as the prerequisites for such a battle evaporated. How could Japan force a decisive engagement when American carriers could simply avoid battle whenever the odds were unfavorable, knowing that time and industrial production worked entirely in their favor? The human cost of this industrial disparity was becoming apparent throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese aircrew, knowing they faced numerically superior forces with decreasing chances of survival, nonetheless flew their missions with remarkable courage and determination. But courage could not overcome mathematics. American combat air patrols, directed by increasingly sophisticated radar systems, could intercept Japanese strikes with overwhelming force. American anti-aircraft defenses, constantly improving through combat experience and technological development, made attacks on American task forces increasingly costly. Japanese pilots who survived one mission faced longer odds on the next, a grinding war of attrition that Japan could not win. American forces, conversely, operated with the confidence that came from material superiority. Pilots knew that if they were shot down, massive search and rescue efforts would attempt their recovery. If their carrier was damaged, other carriers could take up the mission while repairs were conducted. If aircraft were lost, replacement aircraft would arrive on the next logistics ship. This psychological advantage was nearly as important as the material advantage. American forces fought knowing their nation's industry supported them with effectively unlimited resources, while Japanese forces fought knowing every loss brought their nation closer to defeat. The year 1944 would demonstrate the full implications of the industrial disparity Yamamoto had foreseen, though he did not live to witness it. In February, American carriers struck Truk Lagoon, the anchorage where Yamamoto had received those fateful intelligence reports just 3 months earlier. The base that Japanese propagandists had called the Gibraltar of the Pacific was devastated in 2 days of strikes that destroyed over 200 aircraft, sank dozens of ships, and effectively eliminated Truk as a viable forward base. The attacking force included 5 Essex-class carriers along with 4 light carriers, a concentration of naval air power that would have represented nearly the entire striking strength of either navy in 1942. Now it was merely one of several task groups the Americans could field simultaneously. The strategic flexibility that American carrier numbers provided was perhaps their most significant advantage. While one task group struck Truk, other carriers supported operations in the Marshall Islands. Still others conducted training operations, worked up newly formed air groups, or underwent maintenance that would have consumed months in Japanese facilities but took weeks in American forward bases.
The U.S. Navy's logistics system, itself an industrial miracle that dwarfed anything Japan could create, delivered fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement aircraft to forward areas with assembly line regularity. Mobile service squadrons provided repair capabilities at sea, allowing damaged ships to return to action without the months-long transit back to major shipyards. American carriers could sustain operations for weeks, while Japanese carriers were increasingly limited by fuel shortages and the inability to replace combat losses quickly. Japan's carrier construction program struggled against mounting obstacles throughout 1944. The Taiho, commissioned in March after more than 2 years of construction, represented Japan's attempt to build a carrier that could match American designs. At 34,000 tons, she was larger than the Essex class and incorporated armored flight deck that American carriers lacked. Japanese designers had created an impressive ship that theoretically could absorb more battle damage than her American counterparts, but theory and reality diverged catastrophically during her first combat operation. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Taiho took a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore. The damage was not immediately catastrophic, but poor damage control and design flaws turned a survivable hit into disaster. Aviation fuel vapors accumulated in the ship's interior, and when a catastrophic explosion occurred hours after the torpedo strike, Taiho sank rapidly with heavy loss of life. Japan's newest and most advanced carrier had survived less than 4 months in service. The Americans, meanwhile, had commissioned USS Ticonderoga in May and USS Randolph in October, along with several light carriers, 2 fleet carriers for 1, and the American production advantage continued growing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea itself demonstrated the futility of Japanese naval resistance against American industrial might. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining carrier force, 9 carriers of various types, to what was supposed to be the decisive engagement that would cripple American naval power and turn the tide of the Pacific War. Facing them were 15 American carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, along with supporting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in numbers that Japan could no longer match. The air battle that ensued, remembered by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, resulted in the destruction of approximately 400 Japanese aircraft against American losses of fewer than 30 planes. The human dimension of this disaster extended beyond simple loss statistics. Japan's carrier air groups in June 1944 were shadows of the elite formations that had struck Pearl Harbor. Most of the experienced air crew from 1941 and early 1942 were dead, their skills and knowledge lost forever. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages and the urgent need for bodies in cockpits. Many had fewer than 100 hours of flight time when they entered combat against American pilots who averaged 300 hours or more of training before joining operational squadrons. The resulting slaughter was predictable and unstoppable. Japanese aircraft fell in groups, shot down by American fighters or fleet anti-aircraft fire, while American losses were so light that many carriers did not lose a single aircraft during the day's engagements. After the Philippine Sea, Japan's carrier force effectively ceased to exist as an operational striking force. The ships remained afloat, those that survived, but they had no aircraft to fly and no trained pilots to fly them. The Zuikaku, last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, would sail into battle 4 months later at Leyte Gulf with a partial air group whose primary mission was not to strike American ships but to serve as bait, luring American carriers away from the real Japanese objective: battleships attempting to reach and destroy American invasion forces in Leyte Gulf. This was the ultimate humiliation for Japanese.
Carrier aviation, their most storied ship reduced to a decoy because she had no combat capability left. By contrast, American carriers at Leyte Gulf operated in multiple groups with near-total air supremacy. When Japanese battleships did manage to approach American landing beaches, it was carrier aircraft, dive bombers and torpedo planes launched from escort carriers, the smallest and least capable vessels in the American carrier fleet, that turned them back. The weapons that Japan had pioneered in carrier warfare now belonged entirely to the Americans, who wielded them with industrial-scale abundance. The escort carriers that saved American forces at Leyte were mass-produced vessels built on merchant hulls in weeks, not the carefully crafted warships that represented Japanese naval tradition. Yet these humble vessels, backed by American industrial capacity and well-trained aircrew, accomplished what Japan's finest carriers could no longer attempt. The final count was damning in its completeness. By the end of 1944, Japan had effectively no operational carrier aviation capability. The carriers themselves were mostly sunk: Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio at Philippine Sea, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda at Leyte Gulf. The few surviving carriers had no aircraft and no fuel. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull into what would have been the world's largest carrier, was sunk by an American submarine just 10 days after commissioning in November, having never embarked a full air group. She was the ultimate symbol of wasted effort. Years of construction consuming resources Japan desperately needed elsewhere, producing a ship that sailed once and died without ever accomplishing anything operationally significant. American carrier strength at the end of 1944 numbered over 100 ships if all types were counted: fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Even counting only the fleet carriers that matched Japanese vessels in size and capability, the United States had 17 Essex-class carriers in service, with more completing construction. Japan had begun the war with 10 carriers capable of fleet operations. America would finish the war with more than twice that number of just the Essex class alone, having built them all in less than 4 years, while simultaneously constructing battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and merchant vessels in quantities that seemed divorced from reality. The comparison Yamamoto had dreaded, 8 American carriers commissioned in the time Japan built one, had proven conservative. The actual ratio was worse, the American advantage more overwhelming, the Japanese position more hopeless than even his pessimistic calculations had suggested. And those calculations, made before the war began, had predicted certain defeat. The prophecy had materialized with mathematical precision. What made Yamamoto's vindication particularly tragic was that he had offered an alternative. In the years before Pearl Harbor, he had advised Japanese leadership that war with America was unwinnable and should be avoided at almost any cost. His strategic assessment was clear. Japan lacked the resources to defeat the United States in prolonged conflict, and any short war scenario required assumptions about American psychology that were dangerously optimistic. Better to accept diplomatic limitations on Japanese expansion than to risk total destruction in a war Japan could not win. His counsel was rejected by political and military leaders who believed Japanese fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages, who dismissed Americans as soft and unwilling to fight, who convinced themselves that early victories would lead to negotiated peace favorable to Japan. Yamamoto had served his nation by planning and executing the operation that gave Japan its 6 months of triumph, but he had done so knowing that triumph was hollow. Every victory celebration in Tokyo during early 1942 must have carried for him the bitter taste of delayed disaster. When Japanese leaders proclaimed the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and spoke of permanent Japanese dominance in the Pacific,
Yamamoto knew it was fantasy built on borrowed time. The Americans were coming with a fleet that could not be stopped because it could not be sunk faster than American shipyards replaced losses. His successors to command of the combined fleet, Minechi Koga and then Soemu Toyota, inherited a deteriorating strategic situation without Yamamoto's intellectual clarity about its causes or his credibility to tell leadership uncomfortable truths. They planned desperate operations premised on tactical innovation overcoming material inferiority, on complex battle plans that required perfect execution and favorable circumstances, on the hope that one great victory might still change everything. But hope was not strategy, and complex plans could not conjure carriers from shipyards that lacked steel, could not train pilots without fuel for training flights, could not replace losses that were accumulating faster than Japanese industry could respond. The psychological impact of watching American carrier strength multiply while Japanese strength evaporated affected Japanese naval leadership at every level. Officers who had confidently led their forces in 1942 found themselves in 1944 managing desperate defensive operations with inadequate resources. Pilots who had achieved air superiority over the Pacific in the war's early months now flew knowing that American combat air patrols would likely intercept them with numerical advantage, that American anti-aircraft fire would likely shoot them down if they reached their targets, and that even successful attacks would accomplish little against the endless American ship production. The demoralization was not cowardice but rational assessment. Japanese servicemen recognized what their leaders struggled to admit, that the war was lost and had perhaps been lost from the moment it began. American forces naturally drew the opposite psychological lesson. Each new carrier that joined the fleet reinforced the message that American industrial capacity was unlimited and victory inevitable. Sailors and air crew served on vessels that represented the cutting edge of American engineering and manufacturing capability. They witnessed the arrival of new ships, new aircraft models, new technologies at a pace that made Japanese attempts to match American innovation seem pathetic. The confidence this generated was not arrogance but realistic assessment of material facts. American victory was not uncertain heroic struggle but mathematical certainty being counted down in production statistics and shipping schedules. The industrial disparity that decided the Pacific War extended far beyond carriers, though carriers were the most visible and strategically significant symbol. American shipyards produced destroyers in weeks, submarines in months, cargo vessels so quickly that German U-boats in the Atlantic eventually faced target-rich environments where sinking ships faster than they could be replaced became impossible. American aircraft factories delivered fighters and bombers at rates that allowed losses to be absorbed and squadrons to expand simultaneously. American munitions plants produced ammunition in quantities that allowed fire support on scales Japanese forces had never imagined, where entire Japanese defensive positions could be obliterated by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment before American infantry ever approached. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.